Hi everybody, Adam here. So today I wanted to talk about a topic that I think is discussed a lot, but I think is also discussed in a way that very often misses the point. And I wanted to add my own little bit of commentary to it. And that is the topic of the question, why are gymnasts so jacked? I seem to see a lot of videos where people focus on very specific kind of traits related to the sport, which are like, oh, it's because they train X and X is really good at building muscle mass and, whatever the case is. And I think that those kind of analyses very often miss the forest for the trees, in a sense, because they're overlooking some of the bigger, more important, more basic factors that in many ways don't have anything to do with the sport at all. So I wanted to go into that in a little bit more depth today. Obviously, a little bit about me. If you have not been following the channel, if you do not know me from before, I am a fitness coach and a lifter who has been training folks for 10 years. I have been lifting for 14 years. I have been through a lot of different sports, gymnastics, powerlifting, bodybuilding, and I've obviously learned a lot about the basic principles of exercise in the process. So I think that I have a slightly different perspective out there than a lot of these coaches I see that maybe only know gymnastics or maybe only know, a little bit of sports science. And so, they maybe don't have the bigger picture in mind. So before we go ahead, as always, smash that like button to help level up the channel, and I will continue. So an important, very often overlooked fact is that basically any sport, any competitor in any sport at a high level is going to build a lot of muscle mass. That's just a thing that happens. A factor of being in a sport is that you're training very hard, and training hard builds muscle no matter what. Now, there are many sports, of course, where the muscle that you build is not incredibly visible. So if somebody is, say, a baseball player, somebody is a football player, they are going to build a lot of muscle from the training that they are doing. However, they have no reason to cut off all their excess body fat and reveal the muscle that they have built. And so the end result is that while they do build a lot of muscle training for their sport, they simply don't look incredibly jacked because they have built the muscle, but they have not done the work of actually cutting off the fat mass to make that muscle become more visible. Muscle mass is a kind of non-specific adaptation compared to more very specific adaptations like strength and endurance. What does that mean? That means that basically when you're training, for example, as a powerlifter, there's only one real way to build strength, and that is by using incredibly intensely heavy weights, training at very high intensities relative to 1 rep max. Endurance is only built by training at very low intensity for very high numbers of repetitions per set, or in many cases by training things that aren't even lifting, just doing cardiovascular activities that involve very minimal resistance and a ton of repetitions. However, you can build muscle mass training in virtually any repetition range when you are lifting, so long as you are training with sufficiently challenging sets, which means that you're training to near failure on each set. Now, there are different challenges for that, and the end result is that training very high on the strength spectrum, training very low on the endurance spectrum, those things are going to be a little bit less effective at building muscle mass simply because they're slightly less optimal, but you can still build a lot of muscle mass, and you will do that. There are some sports in which, of course, you will actively not really build very much muscle mass. In fact, very cardiovascular heavy sports, very endurance heavy sports, the fact that you're doing a lot of work counterbalances the fact that you're building muscle mass because you're simply doing so much work. It's, your body doesn't have a lot of energy left over for building muscle mass. Another important factor when talking about a lot of body weight exercises is that when body weight is the primary resistance, it's always a benefit to be a lighter body weight. The reality is that as you get heavier, as you pack on more muscle mass, you gain strength, but it is not a one-to-one linear relationship. There is diminishing returns to every single additional pound of body weight that you add onto your body. And so the result is that incredibly heavy, super heavyweight lifters are very strong. They are the strongest overall, but very lightweight lifters are what we would call the highest relative strength. They are highly strong relative to their body weight. And because when your body weight is the resistance involved, that is all that matters. Of course, when sports primarily revolve around your body weight, that means that it's generally often going to be a benefit to be at a very low body weight. And so in those cases, things like where you are going, doing marathon runs, for example, you simply don't need a ton of muscle mass, and it becomes actively harmful to your long-term performance because it is going to slow you down. Instead, you basically just want to get as lean as possible, reduce your excess fat mass as much as possible, and maintain some minimum amount of strength and muscle, and just go with that. This is an important topic that we'll return to in a moment. But this should help you understand why it's just kind of silly to say, like, why does X sport build muscle? Because virtually all sports build muscle. That's just a normal thing. I see a lot of these questions as well that are like, well, why does CrossFit build muscle? And it's like, well, because they're doing lots of sets, lots of repetitions of, exercises that use your muscles. When you do any kind of exercise that uses your muscle and you do it, to failure, and you do it challenging over a long period of time, you're going to build muscle mass. That's just what happens. It may not be the optimal way to build muscle mass, but that doesn't matter. You don't have to train with the optimal method for building muscle mass. You just have to continue to train over a long period of time, and you're going to build some amount of muscle mass, period. That's just kind of what happens. Another factor is simply that when people say, oh, why are gymnasts so jacked? Very often they're not talking about the average guy at the gym. They're talking about this picture they found of like an Olympic class gymnast who's like, by definition, one of the most elite athletes in the world. When you're looking at elite athletes, you cannot compare them to the normal population. That's just not a thing that you can do. It is apples to oranges. Genetically, those folks are so much better at adapting to exercise, and they are just going to be more jacked. They're going to be more, they're going to have more of everything than your average guy who goes into the gym and trains. And so if you're saying, why are elite athletes, why are elite gymnasts so jacked? Well, you're overlooking the fact that there are tons of people who train, pretty frequently for gymnastics, for calisthenics, for bodyweight work, whatever the case is, and they don't get big and they don't get jacked like that because they don't have those genetics. It's not about the way that they're training, it's about the fact that their genetics are really good for building muscle mass because, again, they are elite athletes, they are world-class athletes, and world-class athletes are simply better at adapting to exercise. It doesn't have necessarily very much to do with the actual exercise that you are using. And so if you go and you look at any gym for, okay, what does the average gymnastics trainee look like? Of course, they're not going to be nearly as jacked. They're going to look a lot more like an average guy. There's tons of gymnastic athletes that I see, for example, who don't even, they're not even that big. They're not even that jacked. They're just kind of lean. They just kind of have a low body weight. And, they look pretty good. They can do the movements pretty well, but that doesn't mean that they're super jacked because, again, not a ton of a benefit to having a ton of added muscle mass in gymnastics. And yeah, they're just not going to be as jacked as your elite exerciser. That just is what it is. And I would like to emphasize again that it doesn't have to be optimal training in order to build muscle mass. When you're training like a bodybuilder whose entire purpose, entire goal is to build muscle mass, they're going to say, okay, what is the optimal way that I can build muscle mass? How can I build as much muscle mass as possible while retaining as little fat as possible? And they're, of course, going to be the absolute best at it because they are the ones who are actually training for muscle mass specifically, unlike many other sports where muscle mass is kind of secondary to performance in whatever activity it is in their sport. At the same time, that doesn't mean that every method that isn't bodybuilding is automatically bad. There are tons of other ways to build muscle mass. There are, for example, powerlifters who love to just only do powerlifting and don't love to do hypertrophy work, and they still get pretty decently jacked over a long period of time because they are training hard and they are lifting heavy, and that's really what matters at the end of the day. It may not be optimal, but it doesn't mean that it is impossible for them to build muscle mass. The same applies to, again, virtually any sport. It does not have to be optimal in order to build some amount of muscle mass in order to get more jacked over time. Again, you just have to be training consistently, training hard, keeping it challenging, progressing it properly, and sticking to it, and you're going to see results in terms of building muscle mass. That just is what it is. Gymnastics also has a lot of features that make it good for building muscle mass. Yes, when you do talk about the actual sport of gymnastics, there are some ways that it has some advantages relative to other sports in terms of building muscle mass. You are doing a lot of training for the upper body and the core, and as a result, you could see, for example, a gymnast who has relatively a really impressive upper body physique relative to a bodybuilder who spends, half their time focusing on their upper body and half their time focusing on their lower body. So there are, for example, some gymnasts who are super jacked and who look really great in terms of their upper body muscle mass, maybe not so impressive in terms of their lower body muscle mass, but that's fine because that's not really what matters in their sport anyway. And the last and I think most important point, and the point that I am shocked that I do not see more often, that I am constantly confused by, because this seems to me to be the big elephant in the room, it is the fact that gymnasts are not really that jacked, they are just incredibly cut, which is a very important distinction that I think most people just ignore entirely. So when we are talking about jacked, we are generally talking like, hey, this person has a lot of muscle mass. And we are talking about cut, we are saying, hey, this person is generally very lean. Now, usually those two things are not combined together. Usually it's something where it's like, you've got a power lifter, you've got a strongman who is heavier, who, is pretty jacked, but they are not very cut. And so as a result, the muscle mass is maybe not as incredibly visible. Maybe they, look a little bit, less, maybe they look a little bit less lean. Maybe they look a little bit more fluffy. That just is what it is because they don't need to get lean. There's no requirement in their sport where that will necessarily make it better. Unless, of course, maybe they're trying to fit into a very specific weight class, and so they've got to cut a bit of weight to prepare for that and so on. To return to the point above about how lighter lifters are always going to be stronger relative to their body mass, most sports, again, are not going to necessarily have a ton of demand that somebody is both very jacked and very cut at the same time. And most bodyweight sports are sports where, for example, again, like marathon running, you don't really need a ton of muscle mass to excel, so there's not really any reason for your body to get like that. A gymnast, however, does need to have a decent amount of strength. They need to have a decent amount of muscle mass to support that strength so that they can do all the kinds of cool bodyweight tricks that they do, but they also need to be light as possible. And that means that by definition, they need to be cut. They need to lose that extra fat mass. They need to be as lean as possible. Everything in gymnastics and calisthenics uses your body weight as resistance, except for maybe, some exercises where, okay, you're fiddling around with lever arms a little bit to get a little bit of added challenge. You're adding in a weighted vest. You're adding in a resistance band to change things up a little bit. But at an elite athlete, gymnast, calisthenics, you need to be very lean in order to perform well. That's just a natural feature of the sport. And that is, I would say, it's not necessarily a unique feature of the sport. It is a feature that is uncommon in lifting sports outside of gymnastics, calisthenics, and bodybuilding. But what it means is just that they are probably not actually as jacked as you think they are. They're just very lean. And that leanness makes their muscle mass stand out a lot more. It makes their muscle mass look a lot more impressive than, say, for example, a power lifter, a strongman, an athlete in one of a variety of other sports who all build a lot of muscle mass and potentially a lot more muscle mass overall, but they simply have no motivation, no reason to get super lean unless, of course, they just want to show off and see what they can do with their physique for a phase or two. Many lifters in many sports could look equally jacked in some way. Maybe they won't look jacked in exactly the same way. Maybe it'll be something like, they'll discover that they have, much better lower bodies than upper bodies compared to a gymnast, for example. But at the end of the day, a lot of sports and a lot of different disciplines could be similarly impressive if they simply cut down to the point where they got a lot leaner and were at that similar level of leanness. So I hope that this clears up some misconceptions. I'm certainly not trying to knock the sport of gymnastics. I am certainly training as a gymnast myself now. Since the start of lockdown, since the start of 2020, I have been training exclusively with gymnastics and calisthenics, and I have seen a lot of results in that time, and I'm very, very happy with what I have accomplished. However, I would just like to clear up those misconceptions. I don't think that gymnastics is, for example, uniquely good at building a lot of muscle mass. I don't think that there's necessarily anything incredibly unique about it. It is just a sport that uses a combination of, it is simply a sport that uses a combination of a lot of resistance training and at the same time needing to be relatively lean so you can do a lot of the cool bodyweight movements that gymnasts, calisthenics athletes are known for. And that kind of stuff rarely happens very much outside of gymnastics or bodybuilding. So that is it for today. As always, if you like the video, don't hesitate to smash that like button, hit that subscribe button, share the video, comment down below, tell me what you want to see in future videos, and I will see you all next time. Have a good week.